Hey guys, it's Sam, and today we're going to talk more book editing. This is a follow-up to my video I did recently about the fall of book editing, how I feel like book editing has really taken a turn, and just some follow-up about that, because a lot of people said that they wanted some examples, because I mentioned I could do some examples of areas where I think that book editing is lacking in books, like examples in books and things. So that is what this video is. If you haven't watched that other video, I recommend going and watching that because you'll kind of get a primer on what I'm talking about. But before we dive into some of the examples, I wanted to do a little bit of clarification kind of in response to some of the conversation that I was getting in the comments on that video. So one of the things that came up though a few times was that people were like, editors completely change the books. And that's why like authors shouldn't need editors, and authors should do all the editing themselves and whatever. I mentioned this briefly in the last video. Editing and writing are two different skills. They fall under, media and the literary umbrella. It's kind of like saying a sculptor and a painter can do the same thing. They cannot. Maybe some people are skilled in both. Like some artists are skilled in both medias. There are some authors that probably can edit their books fairly well, but generally speaking, the general population is not necessarily going to be able to. There's also a whole separate thing about not really being able to be objective about your work in a way that you need to be, which is why editors, critique partners, beta readers, all of these people are helpful to have, because they're going to be able to see the flaws in your work that maybe you don't see, or the areas where like, hey, this is all so clear in your head, but it's not being conveyed to the reader. And that's specifically with developmental editing. Again, I talked in the last video about the difference between like developmental editing, copy editing, proofreading, all of that. All of those things are important. I'm mostly talking about developmental editing because that's my bread and butter. That's the kind of freelance work that I do. I don't do the other things. Those things are also important, but we're talking about developmental edits. There was one comment in particular that I think conveyed this feeling fairly well, although it was a really lengthy comment that could have used some editing. But this person was basically saying Tolkien's books were not edited, and would an editor have allowed Tolkien's rambles and some of those things, like some of the songs and some of the descriptions, are so important to the story, and those things would have been cut out if it was edited. Number one, Tolkien may not have had official editing, but he was an academic, had his academic papers definitely edited, so he was a part of like the world with that, and had a ton of well-known critique partners that were also authors. The fact that people are acting like his books were not edited at all, untrue. And this idea that editing always cuts down a book is also untrue. So I'll talk about that later when we get to examples, but editing doesn't necessarily just get rid of things. Editing can also add things in. Also, editing is a conversation between the author and the editor. At the end of the day, the author can say, I don't want to do that, which might be what's happening in some of the book world spaces too, where like some authors are big enough that an editor can say, I think these things should happen. Like, here's my like sort of feedback, and an author can go, no thanks. So ultimately, an author can do what they're going to do. And it's not like an editor is like the judge, jury, and executioner of the work. So in the case of Tolkien specifically, if Tolkien did have an editor that was going to go through things, the editor could say, hey, some of this stuff seems like a little rambly, whatever. Like, what are your thoughts? Why do you think it needs to be added in? And Tolkien could like make his case. Again, Tolkien would have gotten final say, whatever. Also, I don't think an editor would have cut a lot of that stuff out because it is so integral to the world building. People talk about Tolkien stories being like so evocative of like the nature and stuff. Like the man does like to describe trees a lot, but like that's also a part of the world and why we can all picture Middle-earth so well. So I don't think that an editor would have necessarily cut some of that stuff out. That's just an example that a lot of people have of developmental editing, of like it completely changes the book, it completely cuts things out that are important, whatever. No, a lot of times developmental editing could add things in. A lot of times it's just shaping what's already there. So with that out of the way, I wanted to get into just some examples because people asked for some examples. So what I ended up doing is choosing from books that I've read this last year. And this is also going to be like not a clear-cut example of developmental editing. Developmental editing can either be a broad overview or it can be more line edits. An actual developmental edit would include line edits. Very detailed, line-by-line feedback, all of that. I'm not going to do that for these books. And some of these books I haven't read so recently that I could do that. So again, this is over the last 6 months, and these are not things that I read necessarily with an editing eye. This would be a lot more detailed, a lot more examples, whatever. I'm not going to go back for this video and do that. That is a lot of work. So we're just gonna have some like broad examples of things that I remembered from a book that I could be like, okay, these are things that I would probably edit if I was going to be editing this work. Also, it's important to point out that there is a big difference between reviewing and editing. So So my editor brain and my reviewer brain are different, although they can have some overlap. So a few people commented like, oh, well, something didn't work for you, but it could work for other people. And if you were the editor, you could have cut something out. Da, da, da. It's a different brain. So I can review something and be like, hey, this is not necessarily for me, but there's not any editing problems, and I wouldn't change anything as an editor. And I can also edit something, like a genre, for example, that's not entirely for me. Like, I don't edit things like horror that are completely out of my wheelhouse, but like I can read a sci-fi or fantasy that maybe I wouldn't pick up myself, but I can still edit it. Like, it might not be the kind of story that I would typically gravitate towards and be like 5 out of 5 stars as a reader, because that has a more subjective experience attached to it, but I can objectively edit it, if that makes sense. So an example of this when I was looking through the books that I've read in the last 6 months is The Truth According to Ember. I forget the author's name, Danica something. That is a book that I don't think had any editing problems. I just didn't particularly love it because it wasn't for me, because it's an office romance. And I don't really like office romances. And the main character got into a set of lies. It just is a story that I'm like, But editing wise, were there any things that I noted were super editing flaws in that book? No. But yeah, let's get into it. Like I said, this is not the same as a full line edit. I will be giving more broad ideas. I'm not going to be giving very clear examples if I just have the book in front of me and could show you, but these are just some examples from the last 6 months of books that I think had some editing things that could be changed. There's also just a couple things I'm going to give examples of that aren't directly from books, because I didn't have ones in the last 6 months that I could point to, but things that I've noticed in the past that developmental editing would catch, or good developmental editing would catch. So I'm going to break it down by the different categories I talked about in the first video: language, structure, and narrative. So first is language. That's dialogue, physical descriptions, sensory information, things like that. I don't have any concrete examples of this. This is something that, again, is caught more in a line edit. I'm not necessarily thinking of books that this happened in, but I know it does happen pretty frequently. The one that sticks out the most is in dialogue. And honestly, I think as a reader, generally speaking, I don't tend to notice huge flaws in dialogue necessarily. When I'm reading, editing, I can kind of pick it up a little bit more, because I think dialogue is the easiest thing for a lot of authors to write. I think a lot of people have fun with dialogue. A lot of people have fun with conversations. It flows, readers flow with it. It's a little bit easier to do dialogue. A lot of people talk about writing whole dialogue scenes, and then they're like, what do I do in between? But the biggest thing I see is having a bunch of modern words, modern idioms and turns of phrase and things in something that is more fantasy or even historical. This is a thing that I noticed a lot, and is a fairly easy, again, developmental edit fix that all I would tell someone if I was being like, hey, I'm reading a medieval fantasy, again, let's go back to a Tolkien inspired world, and they're saying, hey man, what's up, dude? That's a really obvious one. But then there's other ones that'll just be more modern turns of phrases that you will see sometimes. And it's just that is too modern for this. It's not always these sort of meme-y type turns of phrase that are so online. But sometimes there will be some very online language, and you're like, they wouldn't have this in the medieval times. That's an easy fix, as an editor, to just say, hey, you can still have these things that sort of mean this, we as readers understand, but just change it to a, fantasy or even sci-fi coded thing. That's where you'll see by the gods and whatever, instead of a modern swear, or things like that. Pull in your world building, right? Pull in something that would make sense for this world, because language evolves from cultural stuff. And so this world is not going to have the same cultural touchstones as our modern world. And so think back, do a little linguistic turn and kind of think back into how some of these phrases would have developed. That's where, and this is, again, it's language, but it's also a part of world building. That's how you're going to get language that feels more set in place. The other thing is physical descriptions. I don't tend to see this a ton. I think this pops up a little bit more in some indies and stuff, because I do think this is caught between developmental edits and copy edits will also notice this. But if things don't line up, if you say this character is blonde and then all of a sudden you're saying they're brunette 3 chapters later, so noticing those kinds of things. There's also things with physical descriptions and sensory information that you can say this is something that you would maybe add in. So this is something that I would notice, hey, I don't know what this character looks like at all. You're not necessarily reminding me, and it doesn't need to be beating over the head with it necessarily, but a developmental editor would catch hey, I don't necessarily know what this place looks like. I don't necessarily know what this person looks like. Can we get some more description? Again, some of that world building type stuff, so that there's sensory information for the reader to be placed there. Now, you know, this is again a subjective thing about how much or how little there should be in there, but generally speaking, like you want to kind of have like a nice average of like, okay, some people have a really hard time visualizing and need much more description, and some people have a really easy time and kind of need less. Can we just have it somewhere in the middle so that people have the sensory information that they need to be able to picture some of this stuff? And so this is again an example of stuff that could be added in by a developmental editor. Be like, hey, can we flesh this out a little bit more? So next is structural things, length, order, and pacing. So that is going to be like, hey, are we overly bloating some of these things? Now, I haven't read some of these books in a minute, so I didn't give these as examples, but definitely like a Sarah J. Maas, even a Brandon Sanderson, who I really like Brandon Sanderson's books, don't get me wrong, but like there is some pacing and length things with some of those books that probably could have some developmental edits. Again, I haven't read any of them recently enough to be like, here's an example from this book of how things could be, you know, like cut down. But I will say everyone kind of talks about like specifically Brandon Sanderson of having like banger endings, right? Like awesome. But sometimes the beginning part, like the first 75% of his books meander more. With like a developmental edit, there might be some like, hey, can we get the pacing so it's a little bit more like cohesive throughout? Brandon Sanderson's a big enough author that I'm sure his books aren't necessarily getting the like huge edits, or he can kind of say like, I don't care, and these books are still going to sell. I think someone actually commented in the last video that Oathbringer specifically, I think it was Oathbringer, maybe it was Rhythm of War, maybe it was one of the newer ones. I don't remember. One of his more recent books in Stormlight, people were kind of saying this needed more edits, and he was kind of like, yeah, it basically didn't get edited. So yeah, I think that like some of these bigger books, this is like an overarching, I think, problem within fantasy lately, is we used to kind of have fantasy in like the 300 to 400 page range. We're now getting way more epic fantasy and it being like really big books that I think like not every fantasy book needs to be a big book. Some of them can be shorter. But then also some of them could be longer. Anyway, so this whole like pacing, length, order of things, you know, being like, hey, should scenes be kind of like moved around, things like that. The example that I have from a book that I read this year is Masquerade by O.O. Sanguyemi. There was a certain pacing to that character development in that book. I'm not going to talk at length about it, but basically like at the end, there were some character things that seemed to happen really, really quickly. And because there was ways that the character was acting way up until the end, that there wasn't really a lot of like, hey, we're having this transition. So as an editor, I would say like, hey, pacing wise, can there be a few more things so that we get a more gradual transition? Could we actually lengthen this book? Like that book was 300 something pages, I want to say. We actually could have had some more time of like, can we get some transitional pieces with the personality that go from, this was a character that kind of went from like naive to powerhouse, like very abruptly. There were some things sprinkled in, but I think there could have been more things, honestly, because there was like some pretty major character things that happened. So in this case, it would be, can we add length? I was even saying like this series could technically have been a duology of like, we have a turning point here. Could we have some more transition? I think my biggest complaint as a reader and as an editor is like some abruptness to pacing. I think pacing could be improved in a lot of books. So it's like, can we have a little bit more of this like gray area gradient spectrum rather than like here to here, big jump. And I think that some of that is just like, again, outlining and things of how like authors have the idea of like a character starts here, I know they end here, in the middle, right? And so that's where maybe an editor can come in and be like, hey, here's some things about like, can we move this scene here? Again, not necessarily taking anything out, but can we move some things around, maybe lengthen some things here, and then we get more of that transition, we get you on the path. Lastly is narrative. I would say this is like the biggest part. I mean, all of these things are part of developmental editing, but I think this is what people think of the most when they think of developmental edits. So the characters, the major scenes, the big picture ideas. The one that immediately came to mind for this was the Honey Witch. Again, I'm forgetting the author's name. I didn't look it up, but this was a book that I was like, this editing wise could have been improved so much because I think the bones were so good for this. But this is a cozy fantasy that has very, very low stakes at the beginning, and then the ending is like incredibly high stakes, dangerous, whatever. And you're like, so this is one that as an editor, I would have said, hey, we have some options here. So if you want it to be like, what are you, again, this is the conversation that I would have with an author. What are you wanting out of this story? Are you wanting it to be more cozy? Are you wanting it to be higher stakes? Where is sort of like this getting mixed up? And how can we like flesh some of that out, maybe take it in various different directions? So if it could, you know, an option to be like, okay, this is going to be cozier. Can we lower the intensity of the villain so that this villain, because it ended up being this villain that was like very high powered and creepy and whatever, in a way that like did not mesh with the rest of the story. So it's like, okay, do you want to really flesh out more of this like cozy slice of life, whatever, and make the villain a little bit more of this like grounded in reality rooted day-to-day type antagonist villain? Or do you want to up the stakes and have it not be as cozy with all of these things and have hints of we're having this villain be much more of this like ominous presence, up the stakes of that villain higher. We know more about the villain earlier so that we know it's this like big, scary, very powerful villain instead of being slapped in the face with it later. So that is one where like the big picture elements, some of the scenes and all of that would be evaluated to be like, again, which direction do you want to take this as an author? It's still the author's choice, but what are you wanting to get out of the story? And maybe here's some examples of how that isn't necessarily working and flowing. Also, again, the flow of how are we getting here? If you do want it to be this very intense villain, how are we kind of adding that in and cascading that throughout the story as well? Another example of this that I read more recently is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. This was not, overall, I think Emily Henry's books are pretty well edited. The one thing that I noticed with this particular story is there's a lot of bloat of characters. It's like very character soupy. There's a lot of characters and very like minor characters. And so there's a whole friend group element in this book that really changes nothing. You could completely take those friends out of the story and nothing about the core story and what you're trying to get across would change. So again, I would have gone to her and been like, hey, this friend group, why? Are we just trying to say like, hey, this character has these really close friends that are very important to her, whatever. Are there other ways we can convey that without having them kind of placed into the story all the time in a way that is like not really impacting anything? Like you can still convey someone having close friend connections without the way that it was done here. Hey, you have a lot of characters and a lot of different like plot points, a lot of different relationship stuff. Is there somewhere we can trim this? So this is an example of something being taken out. But in this case, it would also be like, hey, what are we trying to get out of this? Like what is the reason for having these characters in there that aren't really having a big impact on this overarching story, romance, whatever, and are there different ways we can do that? So yeah, those are some examples from books that I've read recently. Again, it's not the same as if I was actually going through and editing them. I would be going over them with a fine-tooth comb. But I hope that was helpful and gave some examples of some of the things that developmental editing does. A lot of people commented on the last video saying like, I didn't even know like anything about editing and developmental editing and things. If you are interested in working with me in the future, send me an email. My information about editing is down below. Bring back book editing. Bring back developmental edits. Comment below, let me know if you also have other books that you're like, hey, this is where I think the book could have improved with editing. If you have any questions about editing, things like that, let me know. So thank you all for watching and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.